If you're bored of EU and Brexit stuff, then this probably isn't the video for you, but this is a video that was requested. Yes, you can request videos. If you're one of my patrons or you support me on Subscribestar, you get precedence. If you ask me to make a video on a particular subject, then I'll probably go ahead and do that. You can also drop suggestions in the comments on my Discord server, wherever else you can find me, social media, and so on. So, accountability. Now, I've banged on about the democratic nature of the EU before, but necessarily there's going to be some repetition of that, because in a democracy, the primary way in which a government is held accountable is at the ballot box, via elections. If you think the EU is an undemocratic institution, you're just flat out wrong. But I want to expand upon the democratic side of the EU and go into how it's held accountable as well. Now, you may be used to the American concept of having separate but equal wings of government that each hold each other accountable, and something similar happens within the EU. We're going to have to break this down into sections. The EU is made up of 28, for now, individual member states. Each of those states runs their home democracy how they wish. We use a first-past-the-post system where we elect MPs supposedly linked to their areas, but this is confused somewhat by the party system. Other nations elect their members of parliament, or whatever else it is that they have, chambers or whatever, via proportional representation, which is much more democratic. They also run their EU elections in a manner, broadly speaking, according to their choice as well, most using a proportional representation system of some kind, including us, or a transferable vote system, which is what happens in Northern Ireland for reasons. The governments are in one way or another accountable to their people at the ballot box. Now, the instruments by which the EU conducts its affairs are somewhat similar to the instruments held in balance in various other Western democracies, though there's a few important differences. I'm going to break this down into sections, and the first one to tackle is probably the European Council. The European Council is responsible for setting general political direction and priorities, and it's made up of the elected heads of state of the various governments of the 28 member states. The Council is therefore accountable democratically and legally by the laws and instruments of those member states, within those member states. So if you have an issue with the European Council's supposed democratic deficit, whatever, then the place you need to target your reform and your ire is the political system within those member countries. Here in the UK, for example, the Prime Minister is subject to the law, can be held to account by their party, by Parliament, and via national elections. Most people's anger seems to primarily be directed against the European Commission. The Commission is the executive of the European Union, similar to the Cabinet here in the UK. They manage the civil service of the EU, they propose or approve legislation, and so on. So yeah, very similar to the Cabinet in the UK. Commissioners are selected by the elected governments of the member states, and as such your democratic vote in your home elections are reflected in the choice of your government's commissioner who's sent to the Commission. In addition to this democratic accountability, a new commission is constituted every 5 years, and new commissioners have to be vetted and approved by the directly elected European Parliament in a process similar to the confirmation hearings that you see in the United States, in which we saw relatively recently when Trump ascended to the White House. Commissioners are held to account collectively by the European Parliament via a vote of no confidence, or individually via the Council or by the Commission by the President of the Commission. So there's several layers of democratic and elected head accountability there. That President of the Commission is proposed by the European Council, the directly elected heads of state of the member nations, and is then confirmed or rejected again by the directly elected European Parliament. The President is held to account collectively with the rest of the Commission, and this has happened historically before. In 1999, when Jacques Santer and his commission stood down before the vote was made. So you can see how the accountability has worked in practice and how it is supposed to work in theory. Now, the Council of the European Union, not to be confused with the European Council, the names could probably do with being changed, is one half of the legislature of the European Union, the other half being the European Parliament. Like the European Council, however, it's made up of representation from the national governments and as such is subject to the electoral and other oversight mechanisms that individual member states have for dealing with ministers or secretaries of particular issues. The European Council, when it convenes, brings together the appropriate national ministers of each member state. So if they were meeting to discuss defence issues, for example, then the Minister of Defence from the UK would represent the UK at that meeting. So that's directly democratically accountable at home, and they also meet to discuss and propose and to approve specific things within those areas, be it defence or agriculture or science or whatever else. The appropriate ministers from the elected governments of each constituent country come together. So that's accountable via home systems. The European Parliament is the main legislative body of the European Union, and it approves or disapproves of proposed legislation, can amend it, change it, and some people get this wrong, but it can propose legislation. Those proposals just have to be taken up and approved by the Commission, the executive. Now, it's not that dissimilar to the way this operates in our country. Backbenchers can propose legislation, but it has to be approved and selected by various bodies, and unless it's supported by the government of the time, it's probably not going to pass. Especially if you consider people like Christopher Chope, who I like to call Christopher Nope, who you might remember from his blocking of upskirt penalties and things like that. All on fairly arcane points of parliamentary procedure, and he personally does not believe that backbench bills are the way to do anything, and so he tends to block or try to block all of them by filibustering and complaining and amending and various other issues. So it's actually not that different to the way that the European Parliament operates. It's pretty academic, the difference. Now, the European Parliament is directly elected. We've got the European elections coming up, so that's an accountability. They do elect a president of the European Parliament. Again, I think they could do with changing the terminology because there's a lot of presidents around and it gets rather confusing. But still, it elects that president from amongst its own number. They then choose a few vice presidents. But that role is more akin to the role of the Speaker in the UK Parliament. That is, the direct debates, and cast votes on ties, things like that. MEPs are accountable to their electorate, to the law, to codes of conduct, to their parties. They're directly elected and accountable in every way you could ask for in a democracy. Now, there's several other bodies that make up the institutions of the European Union, but people tend to be a little less upset or even aware of them, so let's just bang through them quickly. Okay, so there's the European Court of Justice. That's a legal body which consists of one judge from each member country and 11 advocates general. It's accountable to those national governments and to the application of the law to itself, just as any judge would be. Judges serve a 6-year term, and they must be selected from the judiciary in those countries. Members of the judiciary whose independence is beyond question, and those with the highest qualifications, competence or relevant experience. The nominations have to be ratified by the other member states. So there's a lot of accountability there. It's pretty much the same as you see nationally. The General Court is made up of 46 judges who are also selected on 6-year terms by an accord of the elected member states, and the judges of the General Court select a leader, a president, again, from their number via an internal election amongst the judges. So, there's indirect accountability there, but there is accountability, and you really do want your judges to be as independent as possible. I think watching the Kavanaugh hearings and so on has shown the issues when the judiciary becomes a partisan political issue. There's the European Central Bank. That's made up of appointees from the various member governments serving fixed terms approved by the common agreement of the democratically elected heads of the member states. So that's where your democratic accountability is there. Lastly, the European Court of Auditors is an independent organisation made up of appointees selected by each democratically elected member state government, again on 6-year terms. The selections have to be unanimously approved by the European Council. Now, their entire job is accountability. It's to audit the EU budget and the expenses and all the rest of it, and to hold the organisation as a whole to account, and they report yearly to the European Parliament, who have the power to hold others to account. So every step of the way, I think I've demonstrated there is built-in accountability across the various bodies of the European Union and democratic accountability, either via your national government and your elections there, or via the European Parliament. When I say that the EU is more democratic and more accountable than the UK, I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass. It really is. Now, I often say that if you're going to get upset at the EU for being unaccountable and undemocratic, you should be far more concerned with the state of democracy in the UK than you are, because it's much worse here. That problem also applies to accountability, and I believe recent events have underlined this. Now, while there were a few relatively minor accounting errors on the Remain side during the referendum campaign, the illegality, direct illegality by the Leave camp is well documented and wholesale. The Electoral Commission found them guilty not of mistakes or slight misreporting, but of wholesale and systematic illegality throughout the campaign, and a massive, massive overspend. The Electoral Commission found them guilty, they fined them, but those fines, I think anyone can agree, are just ineffective compared to the amount of money being thrown around and used to influence these elections. 60, 70, even £100,000 is nothing to these people compared to getting the result that they want. The case then went to the High Court, and that has proven itself inadequate to deal with corruption in elections as well. Due to the way it was set up, it was essentially impossible to make a complaint and have it go through the process and be ruled on in time. There's a time limit on how long you have to challenge any issues with an election. That said, the High Court did rule, if you actually read the ruling, while it said that Vote Leave didn't do anything legally wrong, this was entirely a technicality, because the only thing that saved their bacon and saved the result of the referendum was the fact that it was non-binding. Had the referendum been binding, so the High Court report says, then the result would have had to have been overturned due to the illegality and other shenanigans around it. So we have an accountability deficit at home. Now, Channel 4 has been dropping revelations like the last section of the Bible lately about the Vote Leave campaign. Aaron Banks' grey and black sourced money that we still don't know where it comes from, donations to Farage's Brexit party being entirely invisible and unaccountable, and he raised an awful lot of money suspiciously quickly from anonymous sources primarily, all just under £500, which is terribly convenient for Farage, I'm sure. And we've also seen that they were faking bringing illegal immigrants into the country. That wasn't true. There's all this nonsense, the targeted adverts aimed at the far right to incite them, untraceable. How much influence did it have? We don't know. We can't know. Facebook's refusing to cooperate. All of this, all of these shenanigans, all of this illegality around the referendum, in any reasonable, accountable democracy, would render the result void and force a rerun. So if you're worried about democracy, if you're worried about accountability when it comes to the European Union, you should be absolutely fucking livid about the state of democracy and accountability in this country. Zang.
What we need now is a radical job creation program. Now, I've devised one here that will create 500,000 new jobs in its first year of operation. Basically, the scheme works like this. Every week, 10,000 working people jump off a cliff, thus creating 10,000 new jobs. I've